My hope is that you were able to use the skills that you've learned already to do this for yourself and to create most of the public area on your own. Here's what I've got. When I go to index.php, by default it gives me Widget Corp. When I click on any of the subjects, nothing right now happens. It just still says Welcome to Widget Corp. We'll work on those default pages later. When I click on History, though, I get the history, or Mission, I get Mission. Those pop up for me. So that should have been a reachable and attainable goal for you. Let's take a look at the code, and I'll just show you what I did. Index.php was very simple. I just took the same connection and in functions. I'd found the selected page, included my header, and then for navigation, I created a new function called public navigation. Now, you may have gone ahead and gone the extra step and tried to reuse the old navigation and tried to do some fancy things with that. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. But for now, we're just going to say new function, public navigation. And then I changed what gets put on the page a little bit to say, well, if there's a selected page, then put out the page content. But if there's not a selected page, then just put up the Welcome to Widget Corp message. Now, as I said, we could do something different if we check whether we have a subject that's selected. We'll work on that. But for now, in that content area, it cares about one and only one thing. Do you have a page? If you do, show the content. If not, put up a default. And then my new function, which is public navigation. Let me just take this down a notch in size. I think you'll be able to see more on the page at once. It's going to pass in the exact same values, selected subject and selected page. I just duplicated the old navigation function exactly, but instead of sending it to content.php, it's going to send it to index.php. Now that's it. That's all the changes that we needed to make in order to get our public site up and running. So already we have something, and now it's just a matter of making it a little more full-featured, putting in some enhancements. But we've already got something that definitely works, and we could deploy it if we wanted to. Now, one of the features that we saw in the final version was that only the pages for the selected subject were displayed, and it had this nice sort of accordion effect where it would only show pages when a subject was selected. That's an easy effect to achieve. We are already checking here whether or not a subject ID has been selected or not. So I'm actually just going to take that and copy that little bit of code. And then, down here before we get to our while loop, before we even actually select the pages, let's just drop in that if-then statement. And I'll go ahead and select all of that, all the way down to the UL. That's everything that has to do with the pages. And I'm just going to indent it, just to keep my code nice and straight, and drop down here and close my if statement. So just like that, we've said, okay, only perform this page loop if the subject ID is the ID that's selected. So let's save that, and let's jump back over to our application and take a look. We'll go index.php, and here we are. No pages are visible, and as soon as I click on one, voila, the ones that below it show up. So that wasn't hard. We were able to very easily put in a new feature because we wrote good code to start with. Now, some of you might have noticed that we just did a lot of duplication, and our navigation function up here looks very similar to what we just did with our public navigation function. And you may be thinking, wow, we just repeated ourselves in a big way. I'd rather have one function that takes care of the navigation instead of two. Now, that's up to you. This approach will certainly work. Depending on how customized the two will be, it might be easier to keep them separate. In our case, they line up pretty well, so there's a pretty good case for actually pulling them into one navigation function. It would just take some customization. There are a couple of approaches I would suggest that you could take, and I'm not going to do either one of them with you, but they're exercises for you to do on your own if you feel so inclined. One, we could have a function called navigation, and navigation will take a variable along with the selected subject and the selected page called public. And public can be set as a context in the same way that we set a context variable before we included our form when we were doing our edit and new page. We can pass a context variable into our function. And we could even have a default value for it. Let's say it might look something like this. I'm just going to create a new temporary line here. Navigation, select subject, select page, and then we could have public equals, and by default, we'll say it's true. So by default, it'll assume it's true unless we pass in the fact that public is false, which we'll do in the public area only. And then we could have navigation call two different functions. We could have it right away say if public, then execute public navigation and pass it in the same variables. I won't write them all out, but we get the idea. Or if it's private, then execute something that says staff navigation. And we can have one function called a navigation that actually reaches out to two other functions. Now, again, we haven't actually kept ourselves from repeating ourselves in the code here, but we've given ourselves one convenient handle to call two different functions based on context. And that might be a good intermediary step for us. Or we could go ahead and go the whole way. This is what I would probably do if I were developing this as a real site, and pass in a public variable here, public equals true, and then I would be able to, on each of these lines, determine whether or not I need to execute bits of code and have code that executes in one case if it's public and another case if it's private. For example, I could have this be edit subject if it's private, but I could instead set that page name to be index.php if it's public. So that's the path that we would take. I want to go ahead and just outline that path for you so that you could see it if you decided you wanted to try and take it and try and take that on as a task. And that's the path that would give us the most reusable code. Now, there's one other difference that we need to tackle that would come up if we had contextual navigation. And that is that we actually want to call getAllSubjects and getAllPages in a slightly different way. Because getAllSubjects in one case is going to show all of the subjects, but in another case it's going to show visible subjects only. So we're actually going to need to make some changes to those functions so that they show only the visible pages, the pages we've set to have their visibility turned on, to the public. And we'll do that in the next movie.